Good morning, colleagues. Our second session of the week. We turn away from policing, which dominated yesterday's session, to return to our work on the inquiry in this 25th anniversary year of the effectiveness of the institutions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We're delighted to welcome this morning our parliamentary colleague and leader of the SDLP, Colum Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, you're very welcome, and thank you for finding the time to see us this morning. You'll appreciate that there are Northern Irish oral questions later on in the chamber, so I think if we can aim to finish around 11ish, that would be ideal as some sort of guideline. I'm going to kick off, if I may. Yep. John Hume, your former party leader, obviously was one of the key, if not the key, foundation stone long back in the process, driving it forward. Played a pivotal part, and I think the world recognises that. I'm going to ask you possibly a difficult question, which is to ask you to put yourself almost into his shoes for a moment or two, and to give us your views on what he might be thinking now, where it's gone right, something he might be kicking himself about. I wish it had been done this way or that way, or hadn't gone that way. And I suppose allied to that, we are seeing in Northern Irish politics, not I think probably unique in Northern Ireland, a squeeze on the centre as things move to the wings. Mm-hmm. What's the role now of your party in the development of the political institutions of Northern Ireland?
Well, thanks for what you said about John Hume, Chairman. I think you're absolutely right. Way back in the kind of mid-60s, he was plotting a path to what ended up becoming the Good Friday Agreement. He recognised the principles that we had, two competing identities, two competing nationalities that needed to be understood, and we needed to work together. You had to internationalise the problem in order to fix it. And you asked me to try and put myself in John's shoes. As somebody who is the MP for Foyle and leader of the SDLP, that's something I have been trying to do for a long time, and of course never measuring up, because it is impossible to measure up to what John was able to achieve, and thank God for him. I think what John and the SDLP, and of course the other parties who eventually agreed with that analysis, achieved was they gave us the opportunity to do our politics in a democratic way. They give my generation the opportunity to live in peace, which is no small feat. I think they ended the Anglo-Irish conflict that had raged for centuries, and that's something I think we can't forget. What would he think today? I think he'd be very frustrated, but I think he'd still be very happy that he took those risks for peace, because if nothing else was achieved out of the Good Friday Agreement, peace was achieved, and I don't think we're ever going back, despite some of the challenges that we face, and we've seen not so long ago. There is still a very real threat there by some people who just can't get on board with the people of Ireland, and want to still turn their face against the democratic wishes of all the people of our country. But peace was achieved. Peace is secure, in my view. It always has to be minded. We have to work it. He would be frustrated, though, I think, that the principles that underpinned the Good Friday Agreement were, I think, about us all working in partnership, us working the common ground every day, us not walking away when things got difficult. And I think that would frustrate him. The fact that, we had 3.5 years when Sinn Féin walked away. We've had, what have we had now? Over a year anyway, since the DUP walked away. And the whole point was you had to compromise and work the common ground and do that every day. So when you didn't get what you wanted, you weren't supposed to just walk away and pull the whole edifice of government down. The idea that that the first response almost is to pull the edifice, the very structures of government down, I think it would appall him. And I also think he would have been very frustrated that we didn't use, even when the Assembly and the Executive were up and running, we didn't properly use those institutions to change people's lives. Because John was a social democrat as much as he was anything else. He was driven by, and I think we're still driven by that, by a real desire and zeal to lift people out of poverty and to give them opportunity. And that's where the civil rights movement came from, which the SDLP grew out of, was this need to get rid of an old corrupt government at Stormont that was keeping people down economically. I mean, he always said our problems are economic as much as they're anything else. So what's the role of the SDLP? Well, 25 years on, yes, we have been squeezed. The Ulster Unionist Party have been squeezed. I think, and there's no point rehearsing all of this, but there was a period after the Good Friday Agreement where I think the extremes were indulged too much, where you would have Seamus Mallon and David Trimble sitting in the First Minister's office trying to run the place, turning on the TV, and there's Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams walking up Downing Street all the time. So the oxygen for the democratic kind of centre was taken away and given to those people who continued to use issues like decommissioning and other things to, keep the attention on them. And that had an electoral outcome that I think we're still suffering from. But regardless of all of that, 25 years on, I think we spent an awful lot of time over the last year, and it was great to have all the presidents and senators and everybody here. But I think for my generation and generations that are coming on now, I think we're very grateful that there's peace, but they're also saying now, what's next? And just talking about it as some sort of, 25 years ago for a 20-year-old is the same as 100 years ago. It just doesn't matter. And we kind of have to bank that and move forward. It was never supposed to be like a static thing. The peace process.
It was a process, not an event.
Exactly. And so you have to keep moving forward. From my perspective, I think we are in a period now where we will begin, and if it hasn't already begun, a very live conversation about constitutional change. So from the SDLP's perspective, I think we're the only party that are interested in building a new Ireland, but also anti-sectarian and social democratic. I think that is a unique role that we will play in the future conversation about constitutional change. I think we've always been the persuaders, and I think we'll be the persuaders again in that conversation. So we've already begun that work. I actually see this conversation about a new Ireland as a process of reconciliation, as the next stage in the peace process and in the development of the Good Friday Agreement. I think more and more people are coming to that position today.
Thank you for that. You mentioned in your remarks there sort of pragmatism and compromise. And the didactic world dictated by social media and the simplistic certainties of populism don't sit well with talking and compromise and give and take and pragmatism. How concerned are you that brave political leadership within the DNA of political parties and politicians in Northern Ireland appears in some areas to have entirely disappeared, and followship seems to be the answer to the sort of dog whistle social media echo chamber?
Well, I think if we had Twitter during the Troubles, we would have been in a much worse place. This thing where you have to react immediately, where you react to the reaction, and things just spiral out of control. That's, in my view, that's dangerous in any kind of body politic, and it's particularly dangerous in a divided society like we have. And sometimes that's even exacerbated by particular broadcasting platforms. I'm sure we'll talk about that another time. And I just think that's all very dangerous. But somebody, I remember knocking a door recently and someone said to me, I'm voting for Sinn Féin, and because one was Nationalist First Minister. And I said, are you? So Sinn Féin have won more or less all the elections now in the last 15 years. How's that working out for you? Because I think the question that never or doesn't often get asked of politicians in Northern Ireland is, what have you delivered? My constituency, we've still got the highest levels of unemployment. We're still being held back by governmental inaction and actual deliberate action to keep people economically disengaged in the economy. So, my view is, no matter what, we have to get to a point where we don't just have a government, which would be a nice start, but we have a government that delivers for people. Where we don't have a society where a quarter of the population of Northern Ireland is on a hospital waiting list, and those are getting longer. Those lists. It is scandalous. Actually, the health service, which has basically collapsed in Northern Ireland, would embarrass a third world country. I have people in my constituency going to the credit union to borrow money so that they can get private health care, because there's no other way of getting it. And we talk about the NHS, and we all love the NHS, we love the people who work in the NHS, and we talk about it in these kind of mystical terms, because the whole point of it is it's supposed to be free at the point of delivery. But if you can't get access to it, then there is no delivery, so you end up paying for it. So I suppose what I'm saying is, in the middle of all our identity politics and tribalism, we're forgetting the fact that we're actually elected. And sometimes in Northern Ireland, I think we send messages rather than ministers to Stormont, and that just does not serve us and hasn't served us very well.
We talk about sort of event and process, and there doesn't appear to have been that sort of. I take your point, and it's a concern that I share, which it can be. Our transport policies haven't delivered, but at least there are transport policies rather than their transport policies, or that sort of approach. And we're all familiar with the film The Life of Brian, where they ask effectively the rhetorical question, what have the Romans ever done for us? And a lot of people ask themselves the question in 2016, what has the single market ever done for us?
I can answer that if you want.
I think you and I would probably share exactly the same answer, so let's not waste each other's time on that one. But the point I'm making is, how concerned are you, not the, and I'm going to use these phrases in inverted commas, not the sort of content, professional, educated middle classes who are as happy in each other's company, work for larger firms, move around the place, share a sort of worldview, but that those hard-to-reach groups in both communities who would say to themselves, I don't go to events at Queen's, I don't work for a firm that allows me to go to London or Paris or wherever it may happen to be, or I'm not doing this, that and the other. 25 years on, my education, housing, health, economic achievement, social mobility, I can't see any positive changes. What the hell is it all about? Why should I support it? What's it in for me? I'm opting out of this. I'm opting out of the political process because it has failed me. And then you end up sort of going back to the full circle of trying to convince those people that there is merit in compromise and pragmatism and talking and engagement.
That is happening. That has happened. A lot of people, and I know that many of them, look at the peace process and see positives for other people. And look, we can't deny it, it's been hugely positive. We are in a totally different place than we were 25 years ago. But I suppose what I'm saying is, we shouldn't have to be satisfied with that. We shouldn't have to be satisfied that we're just not killing each other anymore. We need to.
Any basic table stakes.
Well, exactly, and I suppose this is where I come to the point that in the conversations that we're having with people about the future, we're saying and we're hearing more Stormont's great, and I know you're talking about this a lot and how we reform Stormont's very important, but it's not enough. It's just not. If I look at across the border. Now, next year, the Republic of Ireland's government are going to have a €16 billion surplus, 16 billion, and we're still a drag on the economy. Now, there are small parts of Northern Ireland that are doing very well, but the rest of it isn't, and it has been held back because we haven't used the All-Ireland economic opportunity, in my view, in a way that I think would be very beneficial to us. Now, so I suppose the way in which we're going to talk about that conversation, I think this is going to be slightly unique to us, will be about it'll not be. I get frustrated when people say we can't talk about constitutional future because we have to deal with the health service problem of the economy, or we can't talk about it because we have to talk about reconciliation. Well, for me, the conversation about a new Ireland is a process of reconciliation. It's also a process of showing that we can do things better in an all-Ireland context in terms of the economy, in terms of the health service and everything else. So, people are disengaging, and I can tell you from my own constituency they're disengaging, and it isn't totally removed from the conversations that you've been having around policing. I mean, it's all connected, and I think we have to, I suppose, 25 years later, give ourselves a shake and realise that not everything is fantastic, and I think probably that was missing from the anniversary discussions, and it was great, and it was wonderful, and it's always good that we're able to attract these very significant people from America and everything else, and we should use that opportunity that we have there. But we have to have a bit more self-reflection and say, I don't think this is actually good enough.
Will you, final one from me. This week we've had interesting remarks, which some have criticised for. You can have these thoughts, but they shouldn't be expressed in public. But a key and founding member of, was a founding member and influential within the DUP, talking about, one has got to face into some sort of conversation about constitutional futures. Mm-hmm. There's no point just saying no. One has to sort of try and do, even if you might not desire it, some sort of scenario planning. Were you surprised by that, heartened by it, encouraged by it? How might you see that?
I don't know, Wallace Thompson, but I'm not one bit surprised, because I set up the New Ireland Commission about 2 years ago, and for about 18 months of that process we were having very quiet conversations with people from a unionist background. Now, people tell me unionists aren't engaging in this conversation. It's not true, because they're speaking to us. I mean, we've been everywhere. Unionist political parties aren't engaging in it, and that's fair enough. I'll tell you my view on it. We're going to keep talking to people, and we're going to listen to people. So, because I think we're probably going to have to do a lot of the arguing for unionism, if you know what I mean, in terms of how the thing would look. I don't want unionist political parties to pretend to negotiate the future in terms of what a United Ireland would look like. I want them to come up with a prospectus for the UK. We'll come up with one for a new United Ireland. Unionism should come up with one for, in support of remaining in the UK, and then we'll have a democratic discussion about it. That's the whole point. That's the beauty of the Good Friday Agreement, that we can have a democratic, free of violence discussion about the future. And my appeal to unionism is go off and do that work. I'm not asking you to be a convert to my vision for the future. I'm asking you to tell me what yours is. Because, frankly, I think the way in which some parts of political unionism have behaved since Brexit has actually driven more and more people to be sort of unity curious, for want of a better term. I am hearing that. So I'm not shocked by that. My view is we are on a journey towards that. But I don't believe in inevitability, and I also believe that in order to do it properly, it has to be managed, and we have to have the concerns of the British tradition in Ireland at the heart of everything that we do. And coming from where I come from in Derry, where since 1973, when the new Derry Council was formed after the Civil Rights Movement, a year after Bloody Sunday, we were insisting, when we had nearly all the seats, of doing power sharing. You look around the Guildhall in Derry, we have all of the symbolism of unionism and Britishness still there. We didn't strip it away. We were determined that that would stay, because we understand, and it's in the same vein why we insisted that the apprentice boys could march around the city centre, and that isn't popular sometimes, but because we understand. And when I stood as a 17-year-old at the top of Shipsky Street with John Hume, watching the apprentice boys go past, and some of those bands aren't very nice, and
musically, or
well, some of the music's fantastic.
All the music's fantastic. All the music.
I brought my two daughters up last year, Jim, and what were they, 5 and 7 at that stage, and we stood and we watched the bands, and a guy goes, I should say, a guy goes like that to me, and I said, and Maya, my youngest, said, "What's that about, Daddy?" I said, "That's just how they say hello." But so I was standing with John Hume, I was 17 years old, and I was doing the usual angry thing, why are they able to just close down the whole town and they're listening to some of those chants and songs and the way they're looking at us. And John said, "Are you serious?" I said, "I'm serious." He said, "Well, if you believe in a united Ireland and you look at the demographics of Derry, how can we have a united Ireland if we can't even accommodate letting these people march around this town twice a year?" He said, and that stuck with me forever. And that is what is going to drive us. I mean, we're not pretending when we say that. We are deadly serious that the protection of the British tradition, the Unionist tradition, on the island of Ireland, in a constitutionally changed Ireland, will be, if I have anything to do with it, will be protected and enhanced and looked after.
In short, the place shaping mission which Hume gave to the SDLP is still alive and well.
It is the driving force of everything we do and think about. And do you know what? Sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes we make the wrong call.
Oh, we all do that.
We'll do, and sometimes somebody will be in a council chamber and they'll say something and I will go, that doesn't fit. But in the main and in the round, that is it's a driving ambition of the SDLP. And I've said this before: if United Ireland doesn't accommodate the Unionist tradition, it's not worth having.
Well, no finer voice of the Unionist tradition could be found than Mr. James Shannon, to whom we now turn.
Okay,
I would actually agree with that, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. And just on the subject of the, I was glad you brought it up because I was going to bring it up myself. As an apprentice boy, I've been a member of it for 45 years. I've walked the streets of Londonderry every year. I've seen John Hume there when he was about. I didn't see you this year, Colum, by the way. You were conspicuous by your absence. But just to say that what always, and I've said it lots of times to my own tradition, in that Londonderry is one of those places where they agreed to a parade, the historic part of it, the history of it we all love, and I've been a member of that for 45 years. For me, that's an example of what can happen, and that's down to the apprentice boys themselves who made sure they came to an accommodation with the nationalist parties, and it's one that I point to as an example of where you can do better if you accept the traditions from both sides and understand that. And it's a wonderful event this year as well, which it is every year, I have to say. And just to say, I love all the music, by the way, but that's probably not a surprise to you either,
You are tone deaf, aren't you?
Well, a lot of them are old traditional Irish tunes.
Not just yet. Not just yet. Yeah. I as you also know, Colum was a great supporter of Dr. Paisley and felt that his stepping forward to set the Assembly up, him as First Minister and Martin McGuinness as Deputy First Minister, was the right decision. I supported that from within the party at that time because I felt that was a way we needed to go. I suppose what I'm really saying is that I quite clearly, and you'll not be surprised, see my position within the United Kingdom of Great Britain as a British citizen, and that's obviously constitutionally where I aim for. I understand and recognise that others have different points of view, and that's as it should have. People have individual thoughts and have their own ideas. So constitutional differences are there. I suppose the question I want to ask, because Mr. Chairman is always very clear that he wants me to ask the question and not do the preamble, which I often am prone to do so. With the benefit of hindsight, did the inclusion of cross-community safeguards in the text of the 1998 agreement represent the necessary accommodation that was important to bring in all the parts of Northern Ireland society? And I suppose I'm not being argumentative, by the way, and you know my nature, and that's not how I am. But just to say this, it's so important, and one of your last comments you made to a question from Mr. Chairman was it's important to have the unionist voice to be heard and have that as part of the process. And I know that you mean that when you say that, by the way. But what we don't see, and if we're going to try and take the process forward to the next stage where I want to be and where my party wants to be, is to have the unionist voice within the British protocol system that we have, which has fallen short for unionists at this moment in time. And I suppose I want to just say, if we agree to having a cross-community safeguard, if we agree to having nationalist and unionist opinion held equally in their voice and in their traditions, just how can we take it forward in a way at this moment in time where unionists who feel ostracised and out of the picture at this moment in time can be part of that process moving forward. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim. Just to say, I did miss the Apprentice Boys March this summer. I was out of the country, but I haven't missed it in a long time, and spent many's a late night remonstrating with some young people and making sure that there was as much of a peaceful day as possible. And I've done that for 25 years. The problem, Jim, in terms of trying to satisfy the DUP concerns, I think, around the protocol and the Windsor framework, is that a lot of us aren't really sure what you want, and we're not at all sure what the negotiations between yourselves and the British government are entailing. I speak obviously to the Secretary of State very regularly. He tells me his glass is half full. I'm not totally convinced by that, but I'd love to be surprised. And I think you probably should notice that other parties have given quite a lot of space for those discussions to happen, particularly over the summer. And we are trying to do and say things that can be, at least, whether they're helpful or not, they're not unhelpful. I will say this, though. I mean, without rehashing all this, I didn't want Brexit, argued against it, voted against it, campaigned against it, came here to talk about it before the referendum. I could see that it would be very destabilising for Northern Ireland and for unionism, and that it would end up in unionism having a kind of a crisis of confidence, and I think that is what's happened. And in turn, it has damaged the stability of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. I also think, frankly, that the Windsor framework was a big victory for the DUP, and they should have grabbed it, would be my view. As if the DUP ever want my political advice, I'll be astonished, but I'll offer it anyway. I would have grabbed it and shouted from the rooftops that you delivered something that everyone told you you couldn't deliver. I think that was the political thing to do. I also think there was a council election not that long ago where the DUP support was solidified. The TUV have been kind of dealt with politically, and I don't know what we're waiting on. And I think the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be. And also, we have an American administration in the White House who have literally appointed somebody, a very significant person in Joe Kennedy, to use the opportunities of the protocol and the Windsor framework that we can trade into both markets unencumbered, things that businesses in Britain can't do, and some would love to be able to do, that we use that and we get some support and help in terms of inward investment from America, and we sell it. Like that's a huge opportunity. Like I can tell you from a part of Northern Ireland that has been held back economically, it's a huge opportunity. And I think we've got to grab it. And everything, and you referenced Ian Paisley and the compromises he made. We're at that moment again, you know, and there'll be lots of these moments where you have to actually say what is more important, is holding out for perfection, or is actually getting in and dealing with the problems. So there's the opportunity, the economic opportunity, but there's also the problems where people are screaming at me that they can't get anywhere near a doctor. You know, where immigration is still a thing in large parts of Northern Ireland. I mean, that's not a thing in the rest of the island anymore. We have major problems, and will they all be solved by an executive? No, But is it not our responsibility as politicians and political leaders in a divided society to get in and try and deal with them? That's my strong view. And I really do wish Jeffrey Donaldson well in his conversations with the Secretary of State, but we're running out of road, and I do worry that the longer we leave this, the harder it's going to be to do.
I just say that obviously we have a difference of opinion, and this is not the place for those discussions, Mr. Chairman. I understand that. But just one final question, or supplementary to what you've just said. Both Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair indicated that if we're going to find a solution to where we are now, it's really important that unionism feels part of that process. They've indicated that, and they accept the fact that unionism doesn't feel that the present process within the protocol fully envisages the position of us as unionists and where we want to be. If they've recognised that from a very high position in the Republic of Ireland government, from a Prime Minister here at Westminster, it seems to me that those two viewpoints can't be ignored either. It's just, again, I'm not being argumentative, I'm just putting forward the point that there's two people that understand why it's important to have unionism as part of this process, and they recognise it as it is at this moment in time, that unionism can't be part of that simply because they haven't got the position that they wish to have. And we're not looking for everything when we put forward our viewpoint, but at this moment in time, the process doesn't seem to be delivering for unionism, and those elections have proved that to be the case.
Well, I would actually say, well, first of all, I'm not sure that Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern have said that they don't support the Windsor Framework. I think most people recognise that was a huge advance in terms of the DUP's position, and I just think this characterisation that unionism is outside the room somehow. I can tell you, I'm outside the room. Everybody else is outside the room. The only people in the room are the DUP. The only real conversations happening right now, and this has been the case, by the way, for the last number of years, where it has constantly been, politics has constantly revolved around what does the DUP want. Of course, I don't want to point it, we have to point this out. The DUP argued for Brexit. They voted for Brexit. Then they were in government, basically, with Theresa May, and ensured that we couldn't have a soft Brexit, which would have, I think, been a much better outcome for all of us, and clung on to this vision of Brexit that was never realisable, and that couldn't sit alongside the reality on the ground in terms of our geographical and trading position as part of an island, where the other part is in the single market and customs union. And now we still don't really know what the DUP want. And so I don't think the DUP, I think the whole politics has been obsessed with what the DUP wants and been held back because of what the DUP have done and said over the last number of years. And I mean, I'm happy to talk to anybody in the DUP, but I still don't know what they want. I don't understand what the negotiations are about.
I don't think we should be doing Windsor Framework negotiations here. I mean, on the back of this, though, and everybody's conscious of the situation with policing and health and so on and so forth. Do you think, Mr. Eastwood, that it was ever envisaged? You referenced the collapse triggered by Sinn Féin. You've referenced the collapse triggered by the DUP. Do you think it was ever envisaged that it would be that opportunity to collapse, that right to collapse, if you will, mechanism, would be used on a Party X wants Y, Party X doesn't get Y, or it gets a bit of Y that it doesn't quite approve of, and therefore it pulls everything down? Because it always seemed a very odd right to create. We have huge rows in this space, and no one party can walk out. Well, they can, but business continues, and votes go one way or the other, with or without them. That needs to be looked at, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it was envisaged at all, actually. And what actually tends to happen is a party walks out over one thing. We enter into negotiations that sometimes go on for years, and by the end of it, you go, "What did they walk out about again?" Because we've talked about everything else but that.
But given the history, given the historical antagonisms, etc., it always struck me as a rather peculiar thing to have put a right to create, because there really should be no surprise that in that backdrop of competing traditions and worldviews, that it was likely to be used?
Again, like I said earlier, I don't see the agreement as a static document, and I believe very strongly in reform. There's a review mechanism within the Good Friday Agreement that allows you to review and reform, and we've done it before. To the detriment, I would argue, sometimes, and sometimes for the better. And I think creating opposition, the position of opposition, and we were very involved in working with John McAllister on that, was a very positive thing, actually, and will prove to be, again, in terms of trying to normalise politics. I'm not wedded to the letter of the agreement if it's not working. And I think a blind man, a galloping horse could tell you that it's not working right now. And we have to be honest about that. So we have put forward proposals to the MEPOC bill, where we've looked at things like allowing for 2/3 support for the election of the First and Deputy First Minister, where the First and Deputy First Minister would once again have to be elected jointly by the whole Assembly, rather than it being privatised to the two largest political parties. I think all those things would go a long way. But there's an old saying, and there's an old story in Ireland where you stop somebody in a country road and ask them how to get somewhere, and they say, well, I wouldn't start from here. So we are in a very particular and peculiar place. The Good Friday Agreement institutions recognise the division and have kind of given voice to that, but they were never supposed to be static, in my view. We have to recognise that more people don't identify solely as in terms of their constitutional position. We have to absolutely recognise that. I want to move to a more normalised society and a more normalised politics, but I don't think it's as simple as some people have suggested. And the one thing I will say is that I think first and foremost we need a government. I think, and I can tell you from what I think people are feeling on the ground, is that Michelle O'Neill needs to be First Minister because she was elected as First Minister, and the anger in the run-up to that election from people, particularly within the nationalist community, because it looked like she was going to be denied being First Minister, I think has created a particular political dynamic in the system. That needs to be respected and endorsed, and there needs to be a government on the basis of that election. And I think then we can have a grown-up conversation about the future and how we look at the institutions. I have a slight concern about saying let's have a look at reform now in advance of a government being formed, because I just know from my own experience that what will happen was, whilst we think we're going in to do one small thing, we'll open up the whole thing. And that might be the right thing to do, but that will take years, and we'll still have nobody dealing with the health service and the economy and everything else. And some people will create all sorts of trouble in the middle of those negotiations and take away some of the things that can't be taken away in terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
Okay. Did you have anything else? No.
I think I've seen all back.
There.
Thank you very much. I had intended to ask about some of those changes, but we've covered them. So I just wanted to talk to you about the effectiveness of, or lack thereof, of the Stormont Assembly, and whether or not it is fair to compare that with the outputs of other devolved assemblies in Scotland and Wales.
Well, it's obviously different. You either have 4 or 5 or whatever number of parties in an executive, and you have to agree a programme for government and all of that. So it's never, it's not going to be as efficient as the Scottish Government, which for a long time was one party, now it's 2 party, and they have a clear political mandate to implement their policies. But I also don't think it's a good enough excuse to say it's really hard, therefore we haven't dealt with some of the underlying economic problems, or we haven't done anything to deal with waiting lists. We haven't really had a grown-up conversation about the health estate and how we're probably wasting an awful lot of money and not getting the outcomes that people deserve. So I think there's an obvious element of truth that it's more difficult given our particular makeup, but I don't think it's a good enough excuse. And as somebody who was one of the leaders in the opposition the short period that we had it for, we were very vocal, and as you know, in raising some of those issues and hoping and trying to make government better. So I do think actually if we get Stormont back up and running, the very fact that we will have an opposition will begin to help hold political parties to account. I'd love to see elections based on delivery rather than just, how do we send the biggest message. Some of the changes that we've talked about, I think, can help that. Actually, the whole First and Deputy First Minister thing, I just don't think it's serving us. I think it's a lie. We don't have a First and Deputy First Minister. We've two First Ministers. I mean, they have exactly the same powers, and one can't operate without the other. And this constant fight that we have in every Assembly election as to who's going to be First Minister, it's very understandable, very emotional, it's very symbolic, but it doesn't get any jobs in Derry, and it doesn't build a motorway or a university, or doesn't solve the health crisis. So, I mean, yeah, well, there's lots of things we need to change, but I think I'd love to see a politics development that's about outcomes rather than symbolism.
Okay, you've said there that you're committed to reform of the Assembly, and I think that's important. Do you think for the here and now, do you think that a working Assembly, maybe a reformed Assembly, is adequate to deliver our economic and social potential? And if you don't, do you see ways that the values of partnership and cooperation embedded in the Good Friday Agreement can continue in a new Ireland?
Yeah, well, I think they have to. First of all, I don't think we're ever going to achieve our full potential as part of the UK. I just don't believe that. I mean, I look across the border at what's going on in Dublin, the massive economic advance. They have every major company in the world is based in Dublin. They don't have an economic problem. There's some other problems that they have to resolve, but I wouldn't mind having a 16 billion surplus to try and resolve some of them. But as I've said already, I think for me, constitutional change isn't just about changing a flag over a building. It's actually about embracing the ideas of a new Ireland, which is about all the traditions of the island coming together in a different constitutional setup where we can reach our full potential economically in terms of outcomes for public services. But again, if we don't make those arguments for the British tradition being respected, the Unionist population being treated properly in a constitutional setup, I'm not sure who's going to make them. Because if I look around the political landscape in Northern Ireland right now, we are the only party who believes in a new Ireland who I think are credible in terms of reconciliation and being anti-sectarian. I just think that's a fact.
Thank you. No, that's all for me.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Farry.
Hey, thanks very much, Chair. Good morning to Colum. Just to pick up, first of all, Colum, one of your previous answers where you expressed some doubt or scepticism on the notion of reform ahead of restoration of the Assembly. On the back of that, could I ask you, if we're into a prolonged impasse, arguably we're in a prolonged impasse already, but if by October it's clear things aren't going to be restored, what in effect then is your effective plan B, and potentially anticipating that it may be an enhanced consultative role for the Irish Government, or even as far as joint authority of some description? Wouldn't those be in themselves even more radical reforms ahead of restoration than altering some of the rules and mechanisms in the Assembly?
Well, I think two things at the same time, actually, Stephen. I think right now the position has to be that we have a government set up first and foremost. And I think people just need to understand the anger, particularly within the nationalist community, that led to that huge Sinn Féin vote, because they were told that even if a nationalist was elected as First Minister, then they wouldn't be able to be First Minister. I mean, there's a historical reason why that makes people very angry, and I just think that needs to be dealt with, and that mandate needs to be respected. But I suppose if we do end up in a situation where this becomes very prolonged, then the analysis will have to change about what we do and when we do it. But I do think actually a greater enhanced role for the Irish Government. First of all, I want the institutions, the way they're constituted, to be up and running first and foremost. But right now, we only have potentially, we could have direct rule very quickly. We've already had a budget passed on Monday night by the British government. There is no role at all for anybody other than the Unionist tradition right now in the governance of Northern Ireland. And I think that is quite a dangerous position to be in. So actually, a greater role for the Irish Government does, I think, give more voice to what the Good Friday Agreement was about than anything else. But again, it's as I say, it's a plan B. I think maybe even the threatening of it would have an impact in terms of negotiations with the DUP. And I would suggest that the carrot has been given and it's been eaten. And where's the stick? You know, I think this government needs to get serious about in their dealings with the DUP if this continues to go on.
Now, I appreciate it. I mean, we're starting from a base, or the potential for all options having problems and drawbacks.
Yeah.
In the context that there was an enhanced consultative role for the Irish government, I'm conscious this is London and Dublin talking, but it's not the voices in Northern Ireland. And I mean, do you see what sort of scope do you see for bringing those voices into the equation?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, this is not what I want. I want the Assembly up and running. I want local people working together in a substantial common interest to deliver some of the changes that we need. So that just has to be the number one priority. But nothing ever gets done properly if the two governments aren't speaking to each other, or if they're not involving all the political parties. You know that as well as I do. So I think we need to find mechanisms for doing that. I also think we could have an Assembly up and running tomorrow if we made some changes to how we elect a Speaker. You know, if one of our proposals was that we would have, you need 2/3 to elect a Speaker. Well, both Mike Nesbitt and Patsy McGlone reached that threshold in the last time we tried to elect a Speaker. They didn't have a majority of both communities. I think maybe you agree with me on this. That would be a change that I think would move us in the direction that you probably want to go maybe a wee bit quicker than I do. But but I think we're all on the same road, or at least we want to go a lot further than you do in some of the other stuff. But I think that would make a huge difference. We could have an Assembly tomorrow morning. Maybe it'd be less of a leap then for the DUP to go back into government.
Your answer there leads very, very neatly into the next question, and also you made reference earlier on to the rise of other identities in Northern Ireland, particularly over the past 25 years. Yep. So taking into account your proposal in terms of a weighted majority vote for electing the Speaker, more generally, what is the SDLP's current view on the reform of the system of designations and the voting system more generally?
Well, I also believe that we could elect the First and Deputy First Minister with a 2/3 majority. We have that already in the Good Friday Agreement for calling an election. You know, I don't know why we wouldn't move to that. Look, I think we're comfortable in the direction of travel to get as far away from designation as possible, but we also recognise where we are and the history, and it has to be done properly and carefully. And I do just caution people in terms of the discussion around reform is that we do it properly, because the minute, like I've seen some, proposals in this House from some members of the DUP about changing the fundamental part of the Good Friday Agreement, which is about consent. And moving the goalposts around that. So, I think that'll be a proposal that will go into the mix when we have a discussion about reform. So all I'm saying is, we recognise, particularly the enhanced position of the Alliance Party. We recognise that people, and I don't just have one identity. I'm a Social Democrat. Yes, I believe in Irish unity. I've got a whole lot of things that make up who I am. And I'm not comfortable really just writing down nationalist on a piece of paper. But we're there for a reason. We all understand that reason. We want to move away from it. I think some of our proposals are moving us along that road. But I would also say this, outcomes are more important than structures. And if we don't have people who are prepared to work the common ground all the time, then it really won't matter what you do with reform. We'll find another way of collapsing the thing. But I'm with you. We need reform needed as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Farry. Sir Robert, Buckland.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Eastwood. I think you've already touched on the issue of communal designation. I just want to come back to that. It's interesting to note, isn't it, that in the main business of the Assembly for the last 25 years, most votes are majoritarian anyway, and we hit this block when it comes to appointments and the preliminaries which we need to get through in order to get on with the business of government. And you've talked about 2/3. Another idea we've had evidence on is getting rid of communal designation for all legislation except items where there is a request of at least 40% of MLAs to do so. And if that threshold is met, perhaps then a rationing system so we don't end up with too many of those votes in one session. I wonder what you think of that potential idea as a way forward.
I'm not quite sure how that would actually work, but I would say, I think in the last assembly that we had during the COVID time, I don't think it was used at all. The sort of designation issue, it didn't come up, and actually the change in dynamics and numbers and stuff around the assembly have probably facilitated that. So I mean, we will look at any proposal. We think our 2/3 one is sensible and probably captures the majority of the issues. I mean, I think from your perspective as a committee, I would just suggest that there are 3 strands in the Good Friday Agreement. And actually, the way in which Strand 2 has developed, I think if you had told me in 1998 that Strand 2, North-South, was going to develop or not develop in the way that it has, I would struggle to vote for the Good Friday Agreement. This wasn't an internal settlement to Northern Ireland. I think there's big enhancements that we can make to make sure the North-South Ministerial Council works better. I mean, we love vetoes in Northern Ireland, this idea that ministers can veto that as well. It's not working at all now. We haven't developed at all for the modern world the kind of North-South bodies that we could have. Issues like climate, biodiversity that don't quite understand a border. I also think we should have one inward investment body on the island of Ireland. That was a proposal at the time. It didn't get... And there are all sorts of interested parties who oppose that. I think it's a perfectly sensible and would be very beneficial to those of us in the north. So I suppose, and I'm sure you are looking at this, when you're looking at all these things, there's more to it than just sort of Strand 1 in the Assembly and the Executive. Yeah. I'd also like to see more enhanced East-West institutions. And actually, in our vision of a new Ireland, we would be looking to enhance the East-West institutions, and because I don't believe that the vision that we have for the future isn't about cutting ourselves off from our neighbours and friends on this island. Actually, I think we can find new ways to enhance that relationship, which would be beneficial, I think, for all of us.
Thank you.
Anything else, Sir Robert?
No, that's fine. Thank you very
good. Our other Sir Robert.
Thank you, Chair. Colin, I've been very interested by what you're saying, and I suppose it's only natural that when we don't have Stormont functioning, we start looking at what we could do to make it function better. But in many ways, that is when we're in a position of weakness in terms of delivering things. And you talked about small changes and big changes. You mentioned the election of the Speaker, which I think is one of those small changes, although small things become big things in Northern Ireland, don't they, sometimes? But are there other areas of reform that would be small steps but would make it easier to deliver big reforms, which I think could only be delivered when we do have a strong functioning Stormont delivering the people of Northern Ireland?
Well, as I say, I actually think that would be a big one, because we could have an assembly tomorrow morning. We could have committees. We wouldn't have ministers, but I think it would be very difficult at that point if we could see the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement almost all working, apart from the fact having executive power utilised by an executive. I think it would become more difficult for the DUP actually to stay out at that point. And at least you'll have some semblance of democracy operating. I think having joint first ministers would be actually a big thing. It would have a bigger impact than just letterheads. It would take a lot of the poison out of the politics that we see in the run down to assembly elections. And I do think the kind of 2/3 majority in terms of electing a first and deputy first minister would begin to move us along the road to a more normalised politics. And I think also, utilising the opportunities of an opposition would be good as well for trying to hold people to account. So I think these would be significant reforms actually, coupled with a real review and refresh of North-South and East-West. I think could breathe some new life into the place and into the politics, and help us maybe get to the point where outcomes are better. And again, I just believe we need to have more focus on outcomes than structure. But no, I think there's significant developments. I'd also like to see, frankly, the Justice Ministry not being handed out, to parties who maybe haven't got enough votes to get that particular ministry, just to ensure that a nationalist doesn't become the Justice Minister. I mean, I think that's a bizarre situation given how far we've come over the last 25 years. My view in terms of the slippage and the progress in terms of the new beginning to policing that we've seen over the last couple of years, I think not having a nationalist as Justice First Minister just for the very fact that they might be a nationalist is very undermining of the buy-in that we need to see from all communities to policing and justice.
I mean, looking at what's been successful in England, where we've had deprived communities, areas of high deprivation and unemployment, we've actually seen devolution of powers to local metro mayors. In my part of the country, the Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchin is delivering some amazing things and being given multi-annual budgets to do that. I mean, do you think there might be some scope for looking at places like Londonderry, where we could actually have more things being delivered locally on the ground rather than relying on institutions at Stormont, which sadly often aren't there to deliver what people want?
Well, I could do that rightly. I'd be happy enough. The Mayor of Derry. I was a Mayor of Derry before, but I had no power to do anything. I don't know is the answer. I mean, I think we have an awful lot of devolution in Northern Ireland. I just think we need to start using it better and actually at all. But I mean, they're the kind of proposals that we would look at. But the problem actually with local government right now, in general, is that councils have kind of got convening power, but very little else. You have. In England, some of the powers that a local council would have, we just don't have. We're not in charge. Local councils in Northern Ireland are not in charge of education. They're not in charge of the roads or anything like that, or policing. So, in order to get anything done, you have to speak to about 5 people or 5 different bodies in order to get there. So, yeah, I mean, it's a proposal worth looking at. But I suppose we're all kind of focused on getting the institutions that we have already got up and they're up and running and operating.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Carla, Lockhart.
Thank you, and thank you, Colum, for your evidence this morning. It's been quite measured and still a little bit.
I'm always measured.
A little bit DUP obsessed, but that's nothing new, I suppose, and that's politics. I suppose there is the perception quite often that there is an intolerance for the Unionist viewpoint, particularly on a number of issues, and I want to just walk through them and ask you for your response on them. Obviously, the big issue you've talked about, protocol and the Windsor framework and the DUP and what they're asking for. What we're asking for is solutions. We want solutions for our businesses that are impacted by the protocol. You only have to look at manufacturing, agriculture, all of those different industries, which are absolutely key pillars within our country and for the prospering of our country. So we want solutions for them. Surely you, as an individual and as a very active public rep, see that we need solutions for them. And whilst you say Stormont can resolve those issues, these issues sit very firmly within the UK government's gift, and it is important that you recognise that and that we get those solutions, because we see very clearly by sitting in Stormont for over a year trying to get solutions, we've got nowhere. It wasn't until the DUP took action that we actually made some progress around the Windsor framework.
What solutions do you want, though?
So the solutions are that Northern Ireland's place within the UK's internal market is restored, and that there is, if you look at horticulture, we can't get. I've had emails in this week. They still can't get trees from GB to Northern Ireland. It's impacting trade. You look at the veterinary medicines issue. There are lots of issues that are really impacting businesses in Northern Ireland. So. I think it's important that you recognise those, and to be quite honest, in relation to the protocol and the Windsor framework, it does to the Unionist community seem that you're quite happy for there to be a border down the Irish Sea, but not one on the island of Ireland. And none of us support one on the island of Ireland. So I think it's important that you use the opportunity just to reaffirm that you want to see a resolve on those issues.
Well, I suppose I'm one of the people who argued most strongly to not have economic borders anywhere. I'm a real believer in the customs union and the single market. I suppose unlike your own party, where you argued for us to be pulled out of those institutions, which were the biggest, take us out of the biggest trading bloc on the planet, and not recognising that that there are two parts of the island of Ireland. One part's in the single market and customs union, the other part isn't, or wouldn't be, I suppose, if the DUP had got their way. So I just think it's very hard to square, and it's not about nationalists where we want to draw a border. I don't want a border anywhere. It's about the practical reality of trade, that we have a 300-mile border with 300 border crossings. And it's not just one. Sometimes you listen to people in the chamber not that far away from here, you think it's just one big motorway that you can control. I mean, these are back roads and country roads. And I genuinely, anyway, I think the DUP's position has made absolutely no sense. I recognise, of course, there are issues. There are impositions that result in leaving a trading bloc. I think that was kind of what we were saying during the referendum campaign. And we have worked very diligently with the British government, with the Irish government, with the European Union to try to resolve a lot of those issues that you say. I think most people in manufacturing think it's a very good thing, actually. The Windsor Framework, that the opportunity to trade across the world as a result of basically being back in the single market is a very good thing. I think in terms of agriculture, well, you know, large parts of the agricultural industry were doing all Ireland co-ops long before the Good Friday Agreement even was created, because they understood the benefits in terms of raw numbers for working in that particular way. And leaving the European Union is not a very good thing for the agriculture industry, in my view. But look, as I've said, we are open to listening and we're trying to give space. But there comes a moment, very soon I think, that the British government are going to have to say to the DUP, you're either in or you're out, because this doesn't make, I mean, what more do you want? And I think the Windsor Framework was a victory for the DUP, and you should take it and run with it. I've heard some discussions around the sidelines about the DUP wanting something strong on the Union and on the fact that Northern Ireland will remain part of the United Kingdom. Well, as somebody who wants to change that, I can guarantee you that we won't support anything that removes the consent principle. It's written in stone, as far as I'm concerned, that as the Good Friday Agreement says, we won't have constitutional change unless a majority of people, both north and south, change it. There's no greater guarantee. There's no piece of paper that Rishi Sunak can write on that gives you a greater guarantee than that. The consent principle, which of course was always a Unionist demand, is enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement, and from a nationalist who wants to change it, I'm telling you that we will never support that being removed. There is no greater guarantee. There's nothing that Rishi Sunak can do that will guarantee your place in the United Kingdom as long as people want it to be. So, I mean, let's see. I hope there's a resolution soon. I don't think this is sustainable, and I think the DUP's position is becoming very hard to understand.
Surely the consent principle is being undermined when you want to push the views of the Unionist community. In fact, all Unionist MLAs, all Unionist parties do not agree with the imposition of the protocol.
That's not what the consent principle is about. No. So, because I've heard this said by DUP representatives and the DUP leader, that the consent principle is somehow about everybody agreeing with everything. It's not what it's about. Because I want to put this on record, the consent principle is fairly basic and fairly simple. It was a Unionist demand for decades. The consent principle is solely about the constitutional position of Northern Ireland, and it means that the people of Northern Ireland and the people of the Republic of Ireland in a concurrent referenda will decide the future of Northern Ireland constitutionally. It doesn't mean that on every single issue in the Northern Ireland Assembly or anywhere else that we all have to agree. I was there for 9 years. I don't remember ever having consensus. Consensus and consent are two different things. I don't give my consent to be part of the UK, but I recognise that a majority do. So I have to live with that until I can convince people to change that. That's what consent means. And there has been a confusion, in my view, a deliberate confusion about what the consent principle actually is about. But that aside, I do want the DUP to feel comfortable with what the changes that have been made, but there are only so many more changes that can be made, and the EU and the British government have been absolutely clear as recently as Saturday in Oxford, where the Secretary of State said we will not be reopening the Windsor framework. So, and I'll also say this: in my involvement in politics and in the SDLP's involvement in politics over the past 5 decades, you don't sit back and ask people for solutions; you come up with them yourself.
So in relation to then, obviously, you're now wading in with, again, the suggestions of Dublin interfering in the internal affairs of Northern Ireland. Surely that...
Anglo-Irish agreement.
So you're basically saying, threaten the DUP with this and it'll hopefully move the negotiations on. Well, again, I remind the DUP don't really
that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened when Ian Paisley went into government with Martin McGuinness. That's exactly what happened.
In relation then to around the... Oh gosh, you've thrown me. I was going to make a point around the institutions and the effectiveness of them. The DUP will continue to take their stand around that, and it's not a new thing. Seamus Mallon, whenever I was doing some reading up, and it probably had slipped my mind. Back in the day, Seamus Mallon resigned as First Minister because he was unhappy with the goings on within the Assembly. So it's not a new thing. It's a mechanism that is there, and it's readily available, and it has been effective in actually getting the UK government to act. But I'll bring you back, and there's my final point, Chair, to John Hume, and you spoke very glowingly about him this morning, and I know you and many, and indeed we all, hold him in high regard for his efforts over the years. In 1985, he said that the bedrock of peace and order, the bedrock of justice in every society, is consensus among the population and how it's governed. In 1998, he noted that only the most extreme and self-deluded believe it is possible to govern without inclusiveness. Only by incorporating everybody into the decision-making process can we build stable, democratic and legitimate institutions. So it's not fair to say, well, do you know what, the DUP, take it or leave it, in or out.
Well, sorry, I don't understand that, because I think what John was talking about was inclusion. Mm-hmm. Who's excluded the DUP? Well, I can tell you who's excluded the DUP themselves. In the same way that Sinn Féin excluded themselves for 3.5 years. And you talked about it being an effective tactic. It is not effective for those people who come into my constituency office every day of the week who are waiting 5 and 6 years to see a consultant. Not effective for them. A quarter of our population are on a hospital waiting list. It's an absolute scandal. You can have your discussions with the British government as much as you want, but the impact of that is real, and somebody needs to tell you it's real. It is real for the people who are being left behind as a result of the DUP's position. Now, if you have a position in politics, you have to own it, and you have to own the impacts of that position. And I am telling you, the impacts of that position is the destruction of the NHS in Northern Ireland as one thing, and many other things as well. You have got more or less everything you asked for in the Windsor framework. I mean, do you know what people really think? I'll tell you what people really think, why the DUP aren't going into government. They don't think it's anything to do with the protocol. I don't know what the real reason is, but I think a lot of people think it's because there's going to be a First Minister from a nationalist perspective. That's what people think. And I'm not saying it's my position, but I'm telling you, when people stop me in the streets in Derry and everywhere else, they think they just don't want a nationalist as First Minister.
Our party leader sat in the same chair as you did and outlined that wasn't the case.
Well, let's have her elected then as First Minister.
All I would say is you need to be real with people that actually, if Stormont was back up and running in the morning, waiting lists would still be the same. You look
I've been a very vocal critic of the DUP and Sinn Féin delivery in government. I still think it's better that you be there than not.
Well, you may be critical of the DUP and Sinn Féin in government, but you only look at your own ministers who governed over the likes of infrastructure in the last number of years, and certainly some of the decision making there is questionable.
I don't think we necessarily need to do an autopsy of the past.
Yeah, well, I do think it is important that you are realistic with constituents that if Stormont was back up and running in the morning, there is not the money for the transformation that is needed to transform our health service.
We're just not bothered.
So it's important.
Was that the position? No, but seriously, is that the position? It's very hard, so we're not going to bother.
So I think I'm asking you the questions.
Well, I'm going to
answer. In relation to devolution, support devolution. Yeah,
it's a warm enough day as
but
it is.
I think it's important that people realise that and realise that Stormont being back up and running is not a silver bullet and will not take the healthcare waiting list down the 5 years that has existed for many years. We need transformation, and we need our government here in the UK. So I think it's time for the parties to step up and back our calls for transformation of the budget in Northern Ireland, as well as getting political and financial solutions.
Just so you know, it's a new position from the DUP, because it's a position the SDLP held many years ago and the DUP opposed. But leave that aside for a second. These arguments are the same arguments that I heard from Sinn Féin reps for 3.5 years, when the DUP and all of us were screaming at them that they need to get back into government because the implications for the public are huge. And Sinn Féin said at that time, oh well, you know, it's really hard anyway, we won't be able to make all these changes. That's not politics, that's not democracy. If it's hard, of course it's hard, we all know it's hard. We're all prepared to help, and I've said, even if we're in opposition, we will support radical, unpopular changes to the health service if it brings better outcomes for people in the longer term. So we're prepared to do these things. None of this will happen if we're still asking civil servants to make decisions that they've no power or democratic authority to make. So, I mean, I just don't think members of the DUP can sit legitimately after 3.5 years of criticising Sinn Féin for not going back into Stormont and then making the same arguments that Sinn Féin made at the time. It doesn't add up. Carla, that's people aren't believing this.
Can I make one little point of clarification? Because it's been brought up that Seamus Mallon, everybody collapses the government for Seamus Mallon, because Sinn Féin brought this up in June, and now DUP, that's not a matter of fact at all. The record will show Seamus Mallon resigned in protest of the fact that there were no institutions, there was nothing to collapse, and that was the issue. The institutions had been put in shadow form. He said, I've been elected therefore to nothing. And that we had to restart the process. So I just think it's an important clarification, because this nihilist, sure, everybody collapses things. Sure, why not collapse it? You collapse it, you collapse it. We didn't collapse it.
I've never collapsed it.
Join the club.
There we go. Mary, Kelly Foy.
Thank you, Chair. Morning.
Morning.
I'm living on the island of England. I think I'll probably be a little bit more sweet-natured. It's my question here.
I'll try and answer it in the same vein.
I want to move on to...
let the milk and honey flow, Mary.
I want to move on to Strand 3, the agreement. And in your party's evidence, and in fact you've mentioned today, you are unequivocal that the North-South bodies have failed to live up to their potential. Mm-hmm. Do you think this is a attitudinal or structural problem, and how would you address that?
I think it's both, actually. I think some political parties didn't want to work the North-South institutions, and the structural problem in that is that we allow that to happen. So the NSMC, for example, can't meet if there's no executive, obviously, but there can't be a meeting of the NSMC even when there is an executive if there isn't a Unionist and a Nationalist minister. I think that is just a veto too far, and it is unnecessary. And I just think we have to remember that, and this is often forgotten, when people were making the argument for the Good Friday Agreement, there was give and take on all sides. So a lot of people in the nationalist community didn't want any institutions at Stormont, but they absolutely didn't want institutions only at Stormont. There had to be a North-South element. I mean, this was a core argument right back to Sunningdale. so if those institutions aren't working, or if they haven't evolved in terms of the modern world, then I think we have a problem. So I would like to see a proper review and refresh of Strand 2. And I've been warning about this for about 10 years, and I think it is having an impact. And I do worry if we were in this position with North South now, and if people thought that's what we would be in 1998, then it'd be a very hard sell.
Thanks for that. And you've given the impression that there's undelivered potential with the Strand 3 bodies. Could you outline a little bit more about why these bodies are so important in relation to the role that they play in the all-island cooperation?
Well, I suppose it was the last thing probably that was negotiated at Good Friday, and David Trimble was very determined to have as limited as possible North-South institutions, and it was a matter of kind of dying hours of a negotiation and how they were determined. My view is we can expand them. We particularly need to recognise that Brexit has happened, and that there is paragraph 17 of the Strand 2 part of the Good Friday Agreement allows for us to use these institutions in terms of our dealings with the European Union and legislation that's coming down the line. Of course, there are also mechanisms now within the Windsor framework that allow for that as well. I think inward investment in terms of an all-Ireland body would be a very good one. Frankly, I think we're hamstrung when Invest Northern Ireland go to places like the United States and they're up against the ADA in the south, who are just have got all the opportunities that a proper instituted government with all the powers, the fiscal powers and everything else that they're allowed to have. So that's one thing that I would do. I would have done it. It's actually, some of the resistance from that has come from Dublin over the years, understandably maybe. But I think that's one thing that I would do. But the whole thing needs refreshed and enhanced. Most importantly, it shouldn't be allowed to be held back or stop meeting if one particular political party don't want to work those institutions.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Chair.
Anything else?
Further questions, Your Honour?
Thank you. Politically, politicians often are behind the curve of the public.
Been there myself.
The public will be a bit frightened by that. Oh, that's too big an issue for the public to get its head around. Oh, it's too scary a change, etc. This committee's been doing quite a bit of engagement with ordinary folk across Northern Ireland on this issue, and their understanding of support for, and indeed clamour for, change to how Stormont operates, what it can do, how it can do it, better working together, etc., is clear and palpable. Let me ask this sort of final question, which I suppose is a sort of slight reprise of my first. The bravery of political leadership to make the weather, to lead a debate, to convince through advocacy, appears to be on the wane. I mean, almost across the piece, not reserved to Northern Ireland, but generally. And the comfort of echo chambers and dog whistles allow tribal politics to triumph, and there's the greatest risk of that happening, as we know, in Northern Ireland, given the history of the past. When do the politicians show the leadership of a previous generation who effectively say, look, the banking of peace as a dividend, which should actually just be a normal thing in a civilised society, is not that great a prize, because it should be a normal thing. Let's now lead and shape this debate. Let us say that pragmatism and compromise aren't dirty words, aren't signs of weakness, aren't signs of bending the knee and defeat, and the other side have won. Do we go to formal civic fora, citizens' assemblies? Do we have a national conversation convened by Dublin and Westminster to lead and shape that, and effectively say to local politicians in Northern Ireland, you may not want to listen to what your electorates are saying, or the people of Northern Ireland are saying, but this is what they are saying, here's the script?
Well, I agree with you about the lack of political bravery. I think I try and be brave when I think it's I try and say what I think and what I think is necessary, even if it isn't always particularly popular in the moment. Great tradition of the SDLP is we say things and when they're not all that popular, and then others say them when they are popular, and that's fine if that's our role. Sometimes I actually think the bravery issue has come about with the distance from violence. So when that great generation in 1998 signed up to things that nobody thought they'd sign up to, they did it because they understood the alternative, and they understood that the alternative was violence in the streets and people dying. I think there's a comfort in the peace process that is a very good thing, but it just the impact of that has been we forget that we have to keep moving forward, we have to keep coming together, we have to keep taking brave decisions, and that has led to a kind of stagnation in our politics at times. I'm all for, and we have made these proposals in the past, for civic engagement in all different types of ways. And that, for me, won't just be about the internal operations of Stormont or anything else. We are literally engaged ourselves through our New Ireland Commission in civic engagement every week, and we intend to continue that. I have called, I think since 2016, in the Irish Government to reignite the New Ireland Forum, where I think all parties on the island should be invited to come and talk about their proposals for the future, and I would hope that unionism would come, and if they don't want to come, I hope they come up with their own plans. But I'm a very strong believer in civic engagement. I wanted, actually, during the New Decade, New Approach discussions, we were very strong on this and didn't get anywhere, because a lot of parties say this up front, that they believe in civic engagement, but they don't really want to hear sometimes from those parts of our society that aren't necessarily engaged in politics. I think it would be a very positive thing, because, as you say, particularly in Northern Ireland, I think we're often very far behind the population, and some of the social issues we've been very far and too slow, and thankfully we've caught up with the population on those issues, and I'm very happy to see it. And I think it can only be for the good. And actually, the experience of the south of Ireland, where there's a similar situation, where politicians are never quite sure, in the multi-seat constituencies, they're never quite sure where people are on some of these big issues. And then the public vote on them, and all of a sudden politicians are there. So I think we need to learn that lesson, that taking some hard issues and allowing citizens' assemblies and other fora to look at them can be very beneficial for politics.
And the other side of that coin, because bravery is one of those sort of political words. When all things of Sir Humphrey and Yes Minister, saying a very brave decision, Minister, which usually meant it was terribly, foolhardy on the point of recklessly suicidal. But can I just ask you for a thought or two, a reflection or two, on the self-preservation versus public service? Because you could turn around and say, look, if you're a Liberal Democrat in 2010, you did the right thing by going into a formal coalition, and then you see yourself absolutely
I would argue with them with their own party, but that's
in 2015 for doing the right thing, but for compromising and being pragmatic. You track the electoral support for your party and the UUP, who led that sort of pragmatic drive, sacrificed to the deeper orange of the DUP and the deeper green of Sinn Féin. You referenced the sort of TUV snapping at the heels, and some would argue, well, the Conservative Party had UKIP snapping at the heels as well. which doesn't create that atmosphere of let's be brave and bold and focus on the public service, because we now go into self-preservation mode, because we know how the story ends. We've seen the film. Those who do the right thing, the benefits are then demonstrable, but suffer in the ballot box because those who are the more devoted keepers of the sacred flames of either tradition say, well, you can only really trust us with the sacred truths of tradition A and tradition B. This lot are compromising sellout merchants.
I suppose it's about what your criteria is for kind of success. And for me and for the SDLP, we've been more focused on actually delivering a change on this island. And thank God for that generation who did, because as much as I'm frustrated about the pace of change and want to see more change, the ending of the Anglo-Irish conflict was a pretty big deal. And I'm very proud that that generation did it. And actually, they would do it again, you know, and speaking to Gerry Adams and taking all of the criticism that John Hume took at that time was worth it. So our kind of how we judge these things is about what change has it made, not how it has affected our electoral fortunes. All I would say to the public is it's probably a better way to choose your political leaders by asking who was right all along and who took a long time to get there.
That's a philosophical point for us to draw our proceedings to a conclusion. I'm not seeing any of the colleague indicating they have further questions. Mr. Eastwood, thank you for taking our questions. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your assessment of both the past and Hope's vision for the future. We're grateful to you for doing so. Order, order.